Afternoon, everyone.
Hi there.
Um, nice to see so many of you. I'm actually working off of a laptop where I can see more than 9 squares, which is very nice. So the thought, the goal is teller of tales, tellers of tales. I'm always in trouble because one of my colleagues back in the 1980s, his last name was Teller. So every time that we talked about the rabbis who were tellers, he would raise his hand and say, "You talking about me again?" Rabbi Jerry Teller. But what I thought we would do is I wanted to give you some background into this literature and into the movement. What is Hasidism? Who are the Hasidim? What's the historical background? A few comments about some of the names that we'll be hearing from, and then give you some insights from some of the scholars who have collected these stories over the generations. The most famous and most comprehensive being Martin Buber, the philosopher. And then I thought we would just look at or listen to some of these stories and have a little discussion. What's the story? What's the moral? Or as those of you who speak some Yiddish, was is the chokhmah? What are we really trying to learn out of this, or what were they trying to teach? And I've divided them up based on, if you heard the reference before, a collection that we used, some colleagues of mine and I used when we did an education program for youth at the Reform Movement's leadership camp outside of Indianapolis. It's in the suburb of Zionsville, Indiana. It's not Jewish, even though it's called Zionsville. But Zionsville, Indiana, and we did an educational program for youth that was offered to different synagogues in the Midwest if their kid, they would send their kids for confirmation class. It's mostly high school. And they would send for a weekend or like for 4 or 5 days during winter vacation or something like that. And 4 or 5 of us, rabbinic students and 2 rabbis, would do an intensive program. And that's where some of this material comes from, of collections that we had made of some of these stories. So I could have looked at more recent collections and tried to scan them, but I found this in my folder, and it was a good way to start. So I welcome you, and as would be perfectly appropriate, well, I'll put on my glasses first and then I'll finish the sentence. But as would be perfectly appropriate, we'll start with a story.
Okay.
All right. Actually, 2 stories. When Rabbi Abraham of Sadagora told his Hasidim that we learn from everything, they were dubious. One disciple asked him, "What can we learn from a train?" The rabbi replied, "That because of 1 second, a man can miss everything." What can we learn from the telegraph? That every word is counted and charged. And what can we learn from the telephone? The rabbi answered, "We can learn that what we say here is heard there." The same Rabbi Abraham was asked by a disciple, why, if every man has his own place in the world, why is there so much pushing and shoving among people? What can we learn from the fact that sometimes people feel so crowded? They feel so crowded, said the rabbi, because each one wants to occupy the place of the other. So
Clever.
this is the kind of literature we're going to look at. And here's another one. Once, as he was playing chess with a man notorious for being evil, Rabbi Bunam, again, we'll put him into context next week, Rabbi Bunham deliberately made a wrong move in the chess game. His opponent laughed, whereupon Rabbi Bunham said quickly, "Oh, let me take that back. I moved without thinking." The opponent said, "Oh, all right, take it back." A few minutes later, when it was again his turn, Rabbi Bunham looked over the board, very carefully chose the one move that would lose the game.
Mhm.
And having made it, he cried, "Oh, a terrible mistake. Let me take that back." And the opponent grumbled, "No, I let it go the first time. This time it has to count." And the rabbi then said, "And what would you do if God gave you only one chance to repent for your mistakes?"
Ooh.
And then this one will leave out kind of out in the air. Rabbi Naphtali had a servant named Lazar. He sat brooding in a corner one day. When the rabbi asked what was the matter, Lazar said glumly, "God had just taught me a lesson." Rabbi Naphtali asked, "What's the lesson?" And the Lazar then answered this way, "Rabbi, you're always quoting Torah to me. So I thought I would quote Torah to God. God, I said," and for those of you who know, this happens to be from the Psalms and Proverbs rather than from Torah, but they mean Torah in a general sense. So Lazar says, "I quoted Torah to God. God, I said, 1,000 years in your sight are but a moment. Now, since that's so, 1,000 ducats, now ducat is a unit of money, 1,000 ducats in your sight must also be like one ducat. So why do you need all those ducats up in heaven? You and your angels have no use for them, but you would make your humble servant Lazar very happy if you would spare just one ducat down here on earth." Rabbi Naphtali asked, "Well, Lazar, did God hear your prayer?" "Yes," said Lazar, but sadly. "And did God answer your prayer?" "Yes, he answered," replied Lazar. He said, "Lazar, wait just a moment," as if it's 1,000 years. So those are the kinds of stories that it's beautiful literature. It's warm literature. I want to give you a little bit of a historical background, and then we'll identify a few terms, and then we'll move on to some of the stories that we sent. So this week and next week we'll talk about the Hasidic stories, and then the following the second set of weeks 3 and 4, once we're into December, will be like the Yiddish stories, Shalom Aleichem and Yud Lamed Peretz, who's one of my favorites.
Okay.
So pardon the lecture for a few moments. Hasidism began in the 18th century in Poland and the Russian Ukraine. It spread rapidly to other parts of Eastern Europe, such as Romania and Hungary. Today, members of the movement are found mainly in Israel and in the East Coast of the United States, although you can find adherents of the Hasidic movements in various communities also. I'll try to explain where Lubavitch Chabad comes from and why that's not necessarily the same type of Hasidism that gives us these stories. The founder of Hasidism was a man named Israel ben Eliezer. Israel was his first name. Ben is not his middle name. Ben means son of, and Eliezer is his father. Became known as the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov literally means master of the good name. And then frequently you'll see him referred to with the acronym of, in Hebrew, the Bet, the Shin, and the Tet. In English, a B, an SH, and a T. So the Besht. They'll call him the Besht. The great success of Hasidism was probably due to the fact that conditions of the Jews in Poland and Romania and Hungary and Eastern Europe, the conditions were so poor. They had suffered destruction many, many times at the hands of the Cossacks. pogroms, and they lived in absolute destitution and poverty. Most of the people were ignorant of Jewish learning. They were looked down upon by the more learned and the well-to-do, affluent Jews in the cities. It was to these people in particular that the Baal Shem Tov, the best, brought his message. He was known as a mystical healer. He wrote no books. He taught only by word of mouth and by personal example. What he taught was that the ordinary Jew, even an ignorant one, could still serve God importantly and sincerely with joy. And therefore, even the poor, even the ignorant Jew could have a personal relationship with God, as opposed to feeling that he or she was second class. And though Hasidism considered itself part of Orthodoxy, it did develop certain mystical and joyous practices, which made the established Jewish leaders, in that time only the Orthodox, they thought that there was something very crazy or heretical in what these Hasidim were doing. So in one example, the most famous example, the Talmudic scholar Elijah of Vilna is known as the Vilna Gaon. A Gaon is a genius. The Vilna Gaon led his disciples and his academy in opposition to the Hasidim, and so they were called again pronounced in Yiddish, the Misnagdim. Literally in Hebrew, it's the mitnagdim, but they were known as the misnagdim, those who were the opponents. They were the opposites of, they opposed the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. Israel ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov, had many disciples. And each formed his own branch of Hasidism in different parts of the world, most of them becoming dynasties. And that's what we have seen, and that's what we have inherited even to this day. Those of you who have been either in Brooklyn, Williamsburg, or if you've been in Mea Shearim in Israel or some of the other communities, they all follow different dynasties, different family legacies, if you will, going back to one of the original rabbis or rebbes who were disciples, if not actually sons or grandsons or great-grandsons of the Baal Shem Tov. But they took on not only the family name, but they took on the name of the town in which they were based, where their particular yeshiva, their particular study academy was based. And so they were the Rebbe of Tarnopol, or the Rebbe of Lvov, or the one that we encounter the most, the Rabbi of Lubavitch, which was the combination name, that's the Chabad movement that we know today. Each group, each family, each historical dynasty had its own Rebbe, who the followers, the adherents, considered to be a tzaddik. I'll talk about that name in a minute. A righteous person who was believed to possess his own mystical powers. The tzaddik, the Rebbe, had a court of disciples who would listen to him teach Torah, feed upon every word, and call upon him to pray to God to intercede on their behalf. Hasidism borrowed many of its ideas from Kabbalah, from Jewish mysticism. They held that there are two worlds, the lower world and the upper world, or sometimes referred to as Olam Haba, Olam Hazeh and Olam Haba. This world and the world to come, either upper or lower, or the present and the future. It's our task, in whichever way we can, to bring as much of the lower world or the present world up to the upper world, the upper reaches, the upper spheres, or the next world. They believed that there were divine sparks that God had placed throughout the world in inanimate objects as well as in human beings. And the purpose of Jewish belief and of Jewish action and of prayer was to try to release as many of those sparks and in as many different ways as possible. They're called klipot in Hebrew. Our job is to liberate those sparks, either by action or by devotion or by prayer or by love or by service, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what the stories try to either prove or give examples of. The most important, it's actually more important than the action, was the kavanah, was the intention, the devotion that one might bring to life or to prayer. And even the ignorant person, or even the one who was homebound, could still demonstrate kavanah, could still demonstrate intention. You know, the famous story, it's not in the collection here, but I'm sure all of you have heard it, you know, and it's told in a number of different ways, of the rabbi who all of a sudden in the middle of Yom Kippur stops the prayers and announces with great excitement that the gates of heaven are opening sooner than Nila, sooner than the end of the service, the climax of the service. And why were they opening? It was because of the intention, the kavanah of one particular young boy, and this is the way the story is told, who's playing a flute. He can't talk. He doesn't know any Hebrew, doesn't know any Hebrew language, whatever, but he's playing the flute, and everyone thinks that he's interrupting the service. He's not. The rabbi says, no. The gates of heaven wouldn't open until the sounds of this young boy's kavanah, until his actual intention and devotion to God opened up the gates. So even the ignorant person, even the poor person, by kavanah, by thought, by heartfelt intention, by singing, by dancing, didn't matter if you knew the words or not, didn't matter if you knew the steps to the dance or not, but if it was said with proper and genuine sincerity, they all would receive God's reward if not in this world, then in the world to come. So that's the historical context, if you will, running through it very quickly. Some of the words that I've used, again, rabbi and rebbe, they kind of pronounce it that way. It's not the same way that any of us in the 20th or 21st century would think of a rabbi, not in our type of community or congregation or temple center. I don't know any of my colleagues, certainly, and even including the Chabad rabbis, who would claim to have the same type of inner strength or ability to heal, to do miracles, whatever. We do fancy ourselves as teachers, as guides, storytellers, if you will. But I don't know of any colleague in any of the denominations in North America or in Israel who would claim to have the same kind of expectation from our disciples, from our congregants, whatever you want to call them, as the rebbes, who were considered to be saintly, who were considered to have such a close connection and understanding to God. Now, one of the words that describes, I mentioned the word tzaddik, considered a saint or a very righteous person, virtuous person, just person, and that could be applied to any of these rebbes, but you didn't have to have ordination. You didn't have to have training. There are people in historical Talmudic literature, and certainly in the Hasidic literature also, who were storytellers, healers, miracle workers who were not ordained rabbis. And sometimes they were given the title of a tzaddik, of a saintly person as well. Another title that was given to some of them was Magid. So if that sounds a little familiar to you, you're hearkening to the Haggadah on Passover, at the Passover Seder, the Pesach Seder. The word comes from the same Hebrew root. It's a teller, one who recounts, one who tells the story, and that's the Magid, if you will. But the other word that I want to mention as being the characteristic, or the most important characteristic, of all of these leaders in the Hasidic movement, whether they were called Rebbe, whether they were called Tzaddik, whether they were called Magid, but they all had the characteristic, or were qualified for this role, because they demonstrated, and here's another word that in Hebrew you've all encountered in the prayer book or in your study, and that's the Hebrew word chesed. We sing the song, the song from Pirkei Avot, that the world is sustained by three things: Torah and Avodah and Gemilut Chasadim. It's from the word Chesed. Chesed we usually translate as loving kindness, but it's really more than that, because it certainly in the Hasidic world it implied mercy, it implied compassion, it implied piety, it implied goodness. So if someone was described as being a person, could be male or female, a person filled with chesed, it was the highest. It was the highest attribute, quality that could be attributed to someone. I apologize for that, was poorly phrased in the English. But the other aspect of it, and this goes back to Bible study, Torah study, is that when the word chesed appears in the Torah, again, we frequently translate it as loving kindness or mercy. But Nelson Glick, who was the world famous archaeologist and biblical scholar, who was president of the Hebrew Union College, the Jewish Institute of Religion in the 60s and into 1970. I think he died in 71, in the spring of 71. But Nelson Glick's, and don't ask me how or why I know this, that's a whole other story. Nelson Glick's doctoral dissertation in German was about the word chesed, and the way that the word, or the characteristic of chesed, developed from the Bible all the way on through Jewish literature up to the time of the Hasidim. Okay, and Glick insisted that there should be a different translation for chesed, especially as it came down through the ages into the leadership of the Hasidic movements, to the poor, the impoverished, the shtetl Jew. And he suggested that the best translation for chesed was constancy. Constancy, that there's a constant presence, or a constant source of hope, or of faith, of positive understanding of the world, and that was the generational or motivational of the foundation for goodness and loving kindness and mercy and all of these other kinds of things, is that someone who chooses, someone who's filled with chesed, is someone who is choosing to be present, to be constant, to be a part of everyone else's world, or just the world and not the persona, but the personality of the one with whom you're interacting. So keep that in mind, that in addition to trying to teach all of these simple values and lessons that we're gonna look for in these stories. The Rebbe or the Tzaddik or the Maggid is also trying to demonstrate, or at least humbly to portray their own sense of chesed, of constancy, of being there for the listener, being there for the student, being there for the one who is in need, being there for the one who is in pain, and then also being there for God. So I suggest that you keep all that, and that's kind of my background of the way that I want to suggest we look at some of these stories. So, okay, so some of the characters, again, we mentioned the Baal Shem Tov, that's Israel, the son of Eliezer. For those of you who are interested in the exact dates, he's born in 1700 and dies in 1760. There are those members of his own family, not necessarily his sons. We really don't even know if he only had sons or grandsons, and if he had daughters or not. But the one who really carries on is his grandson. That's Baruch. Incidentally, that was my father's Hebrew name too. Also, Baruch, who lived in the town of Mezrich, who died. We don't know dates of birth for all of these men, but dies in 1811. And then Baruch of Mezrich's son is a rabbi whose name you've probably heard, and that's Nachman of Bratslav. Nachman's my Hebrew name, but I'm not named after that rabbi at all. Nachman of Bratslav is a very, very interesting character. We'll see some of his stories, and maybe some other time we'll do a joint examination or analysis of his life, and whatever many of his things are published independently of the Baal Shem Tov stories and things like that. Nachman of Bratslav suffered from much depression, mental illness, and so it's good to have somebody on the call or in the class who can add the psychological interpretation of much of what he's teaching. But so in the immediate generation or the immediate family of the founders, that's Baal Shem Tov, and then Baruch of Mezrich, and then Nachman of Bratslav. Nachman of Bratslav had his own disciples, including one who's Dov Ber, also Dov Ber of Mezrich, because that's the town where they were based at that time. And Dov Ber is the one who also carries the name of the Maggid, the Maggid of Mezrich is Dov Ber. Then there's another one who's you may have heard some of his stories. Another disciple of Nachman, that's Yaakov Yosef of Polnoya. He dies in 1782. This is all in the first and second generation of the Hasidic Rebbe's, if you will. Yaakov Yosef isn't so much known for all of his long stories, so much as small, short, abbreviated parables. One of which used to appear in the more recent High Holy Day prayer books. And kind of like gets into the kinds of things that I was talking about before. Yaakov Yosef is the one who said, the high wire, the guy who walks along the high wire, does the high wire act, is only worried about where he's going to put his next foot. he's not, his next step. He's not worried about what's below him or what's behind him. He's only worried about how carefully he can take his next step. And that's the lesson that we should all learn for ourselves. It's a good lesson for High Holy Days, etc. So you might have seen some of Yaakov Yosef's little statements rather than stories. The other two names that we're going to encounter a little bit today and next week. One is Moshe Leib of Sassoth, who is a disciple of Dov Ber of the Maggid, and some of his stories are also very, very well known. And then the one character who, again, if we were going to have a separate class on Rabbi Nachman, we should also have a separate class on Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, who is the one who, again, going back to High Holy Days, you may be familiar with the story that when they get to the certain point in the High Holiday liturgy, that we're all asking God al chet shechatanu for all the sins that we have committed, and Levi Yitzchak stops leading the Yom Kippur service, whatever, and says, "Wait a minute. It's one thing for us to ask God to forgive us. We need to decide if we're going to forgive God." Because look at all the things that God has done to us. And he goes into this long j'accuse, into this long, accusation. And it's been turned into a song, and it's been turned into a familiar long list of all the things that we can accuse God of doing. And Levi Yitzchak starts a whole new approach, rather than just saying, okay, we need to look for God, we need to represent God. Now Levi Yitzchak says also, if we're going to have this strong relationship with God, and we're going to ask God to forgive us, we have to tell God that we're willing to forgive him too. Okay, so you have that thing, and then one of Levi Yitzchak's disciples. There's a method to my madness in getting there eventually. One of Levi Yitzchak's disciples is Schneur Zalman of Liadi, who becomes the Schneur Zalman of Lubavitch, the town of Lubavitch, and that he's the founder of the Chabad movement, which is the most famous in outreach. Literally around the world, there are Chabad emissaries in every place, even where you wouldn't think there would be Jewish communities. And Chabad. So when people think of Hasidism, they think of the Lubavitch more than anything else. Although there are, and I said, if you go to Israel, you go to Jerusalem, Meir Sharim, there are many other different dynasties. Okay, in Buber's collection of Hasidic tales, which we do have in our library and which is easily available to purchase or borrow from I would assume from secular libraries as well. You can download them and whatever. But in the introduction, I found this quote, and this will give us the final introductory comment. The Hasidic tale, Martin Buber wrote, came to life on narrow streets and in small, musty rooms, passing from awkward lips to the ears of anxious listeners. A stammer gave birth to it, and a stammer bore it onward from generation to generation. I have received it from folk books, from notebooks, from pamphlets. I have received it also from living mouths, from the mouths of people still living who even in their lifetime heard this stammer. I stand now in a chain of narrators, a link between links. I tell once again the old stories, and if they sound new, it is because the new already lay dormant in them when they were told for the first time. So if you are hearing some of these for the first time, I hope that you will not only appreciate them, but be willing to comment on them, ask questions, or we share so that we give these stories new life. And that's the greatest gift that we can have coming out of this opportunity class, if you will. So the first page, for those who could obtain it, is a collection, just a collection of a couple. Says a story about stories, and they lead into it. This editor leads into it. A chassid never told a story just for the story's sake. Take as an example the following one again. Now, this is one that many of you may have heard in different contexts, but it includes the names of some of the people, some of the rabbis that I was talking about. When the holy Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov had a difficult task to perform, he would go to a particular place in the woods, light a fire, remain sunk in prayer, and what he had set out to do was done. When a generation later, the Maggid, the preacher, the teacher of Mezrich, had a similar task or problem or question, he would go to the same place in the woods and say, we can no longer light the fire, but we remember the prayer that Israel, the Baal Shem Tov, had recited. And then what he had set out to do, what the Maggid had set out to do, was done. A generation after him, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov had the same task to perform. He too went into the woods, found the same place, said, we can no longer light the fire or even remember the prayer, but we know the place to come to. Let that suffice. And it did. And still another generation passed. Rabbi Israel of Rizhin, with a similar task before him, didn't even get up from his golden armchair. He only said, we cannot light the fire. We've forgotten the prayer. We have likewise forgotten the place. But what we do remember is the story. And let that suffice. And it did. Okay. Thoughts? What is it telling us? Everybody's muted, or some are muted. Are you personally muted? Sherry, you're going to have to unmute yourself. There
I
you go.
unmuted myself. Okay.
Please do.
Okay. So, when I heard this, when I read it, when I heard it now, it made me think about traditions, Jewish
Traditions, exactly right.
Tradition?
Jewish traditions, and how they started, and then they carry on through the generations, but sometimes they get watered down, and people adapt certain ones and don't adapt others, and that takes into account like individual differences. But then when you end up with the different sects or whatever you call them of Judaism, so that each one saves certain parts, and so that's what works for them. And anyway, that's what came to my mind immediately.
So when it says at the very end, it says, we don't know the prayer, we don't know the fire, we don't know the place, but let it suffice that we know the story. Let it suffice for whom? If it's sufficient, that's for whom? Okay, Bobby?
What?
Right, to answer your question right now, who's it sufficing for? It's sufficing for anyone, for all of us. But what I was gathering is there's always a story that we heard from grandparents that have been handed down, from great-grandparents that got handed down to our parents, to us. We tell it to our children, to our grandchildren, should we have, etc. And there's, no matter what the story, whether it's something from school days or anything, there's a story, there's an outcome to it. and you change it a little bit, or you say, well, this is what it was then, and this is what I remember of it, but this is the outcome of it.
Mhm. Okay,
Now, what I was thinking is I don't have to even know the beginnings of the story, or the beginning of the tradition, to use Sherry's term. Just somewhere back then, back whenever, a story was told, an event happened, a tradition was started, or whatever. And however it got to me, and all of those steps in between, it's almost like the game of telephone. It starts one way and who knows how it ends up at the end. The first guy hears the same story. But it's that it's not even sometimes important how the story was formed. I mean, it isn't important even that this rabbi went out to the woods and lit a fire and said a prayer. Just that we remember something happened and that we honor that something today. So that's what I was getting out of that it doesn't matter how it got down to me, it got down to me in the form that I have it. And then I can continue it on, to use Bobby's analogy.
okay.
David.
David, on my screen, you're to the left of her,
Yeah,
okay.
thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you. I read this story over the weekend, but hearing it from you and listening to it forced me to concentrate on its value and its relationship to the concept of chesed. And we certainly need some chesed right now. Over the last few days, I've been outside looking at shooting stars, which brings me back to John Milton at the very opening lines of Paradise Lost, when he's throwing Satan out of the heavens, and he's him, the almighty power, hurled headlong, flaming from the ethereal sky. He comes down, and we are here on this lovely planet. And just listening to you tell the story makes it so much more valuable, I think.
Thank you. Incidentally, aren't we supposed to be looking for meteor showers over the next couple of nights?
Yes, we are.
Mornings?
In fact, thanks for asking, Rabbi.
Right.
It is the Taurids. They are bright,
straight
slow
names.
meteors, and they come from Enki's comet. And Wendy had something she was to say.
Okay,
If I'm
I
not,
saw
if-
Wendy's hand reaching in there.
Yeah.
that's all you ever see of me, because anyway. What this story meant to me came back to a story I learned from my brother-in-law, and it goes with the very last sentence. All of us are asleep, but by telling stories about tzaddikim, we come awake. And to me, that said, knowing that you can just pray, it doesn't make a difference where you are. And when I do that all the time, but I never pray for something specific, like, oh Lord, let me get my house clean. I'll just pray for something very, like, let everything work out the way it should. Like the prayer that can be all encompassing of where you want the outcome without saying it. And then somehow the idea for that outcome just comes to you and it happens. And that is like becoming awake. So it was very meaningful. Like, it's letting you know that prayer works.
And prayer doesn't have to be just the words out of the prayer book.
Right.
Is what
Absolutely.
this whole genre is saying. Let's see, Gloria, you had your hand up for a minute, right?
I do. As you were reading it, my immediate response was so different. It must be a reflection of me, because I like to call myself a historian. I was thinking, oh, how sad. Somehow they've lost
Gloria Clancy.
Okay. Mhm.
they've lost everything about the background of the story. When they say, well, this isn't important and that isn't as important. What is important is, that we have stories, which is true. But I felt
I
so
don't know if
sad
it's a
about
matter
it.
of what's important so much as, well, thank goodness at least we remember the story.
Right, okay.
Not that all we, that, you know, you can take a pass on everything else, just remember the story. I'm
Yeah.
not sure that it's that way, yeah. Jean, please. Jean, then Don.
The thing I got is I remember stories. I don't necessarily remember prayers. I don't necessarily remember places, but I remember the stories told to me. What prompts me is in history books, you know, history is taught. But to tell you the truth, I remember history best if I see it in some fictionalized movie. Like I know more about Gettysburg from the movie Gettysburg, not from some historical book. So if we forget the prayers, if we forget the place, if we, you know, are not able to make the fire, we remember the stories, just because I think it's human nature that we remember stories more so than we remember other things. And as a result, then we can remember the moral of the story or the gist of the story, or like someone had mentioned, what's important. That's part of it as well. But it has a tendency to carry on from generation to generation, while other
I guess
things
one
that
of
are
the,
more
I guess one of the differences is that when you tell a story, the facts or the details aren't as important as when you're relaying history, right?
right.
You know, and each of us telling the story might embellish it a little, you know,
Oh, yeah.
tell it a little bit differently.
Oh yeah.
Uh-huh.
Oh, yeah.
How
Oh,
big
yeah.
did the
Oh,
fish
yeah.
get?
Don, then Chris.
The great poet Muriel Rukeyser, I don't know
Uh-huh.
if you're familiar with her, but she
Yes.
said the universe is not made of atoms, it's made of stories.
Ah, nice.
She had the great ability to merge
She had-
science and
She has one poem that's called "To Be a Jew" I think "To Be a Jew in the 20th Century." I think was the
Really?
title of it. Right.
but it seems to me that the Hasidic stories are more of fables and parables
Uh-huh.
than, I mean, there are different kinds of stories, and so I love fable. In fact, one of the books I published was a long fable based
Right.
on a medieval Islamic poem, and it's kind of a Jewishized version of that Islamic.
You know, again, when whether it's the Baal Shem Tov or whether it's any of these rebbes or Maggids or whatever, they certainly never expected that. Oh, in the 21st century, we'd be looking at computer screens and
Yeah.
you know and relaying the stories. They thought they were just using this as that this was their pedagogy. This was their way of teaching. This was their way of encouraging and bringing a sense of faith and hope to a very small community. They didn't think that this was going to be reflected and remembered all over the world for generations.
Yeah.
Chris, yeah.
Getting
Oh,
back
I'm
to
sorry.
one last quick thing.
Yeah, go ahead, Don.
Getting back to your question, that the fable, the story, the fable it distills our experience. So you can shed all the physical components get down to the story.
Mhm.
It tells you that your world is here. It's not out there. And so once the story is inside you, then it can go from generation to generation. It doesn't need the external crap.
Right. Good. Okay. Yeah, Chris. Okay.
Yes, thank you. I was just thinking, Judaism by itself, even the Bible, is stories. I mean, that's how it was formed, that they were supposed to write all of that, and that was supposed to be our foundation, our, guidance, all because of the stories, whoever said them. I mean, the Hasidic are good about their stories, and they do have a lot of great examples in
Well-
it, but so does the Bible.
I hear what you're saying, but I'm not sure that I totally agree.
Okay,
Okay, there certainly is the mitzvah in the sense of the commandment to remember that we were slaves in Egypt. Remember this and recount it and teach your children diligently. But at the same time, we're warned against reinterpreting what those narratives might have been.
okay,
It's you shall not turn to the right or turn to the left. Just
true.
do
Got
it this way.
Just tell the
So
story.
and with a story, you're encouraging people to understand it differently. I might even say, I don't impose this on anybody, but I might even say that the whole history and the whole legacy is a reforming, not the reform movement with a capital R, but with a small, to reform for the new generation or for the new environment, the new atmosphere. If the story was originally written to those who were in the shtetl, or in the ghetto, or
Sure.
out in the sticks, but is it still viable for the Jew in the metropolitan center of the 21st century?
Well, yes, I agree with what you're saying in a way that it's a little more clear on the times where they're using their examples to bring a clear explanation of what the need is. What I like about the story that you shared with us was the fact that the original purpose for going into the woods, lighting up a fire, and do that was because he had a need, and that was the only way he could solve it. So at the end of the forgetting this and forgetting that, we still going there for the needs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the purpose is still genuine, being satisfied by doing that, right?
Okay.
Thank you.
And Marty,
There we go. One of the things that strikes me with these stories and parables is in Judaism, we're taught that we're a people of doing, and story and in the Hasidic movement. One of their teachings is that speech is a form of action. And so it's another form of doing. And we need to, and by setting examples, whether it's in a story or by actually doing it ourselves, we are teaching others without saying you should do this or you should do that. And let the individual come up and see why what is being said or done is important.
Good. Okay, Marcia?
Well, it's sort of today, people are telling stories of the past. There's a book that tell you story. They give you questions and you tell the story of your life. But it's the story that people want to share. So that's why they were told, this story, because there is a history to us. There's a history to Judaism. There's a history to living and understanding, so that therefore now some of us feel that we have to give our history to the next generations and how things happened. And a lot of it is lost, but the things that we remember sometimes affected us in ways.
And
it gives the
apparently,
reader-
from the story's point of view, even though we know that some of those details are going to be lost,
Right.
it's still worth telling. It's still worth putting it out
Right.
there with the hope that someone is going to care enough about our actions and our words to, in one way or another, carry them on. Gail?
Yes, it strikes me as these stories are really nothing. They really are oral history.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's how I would define them. They're actually oral history,
Right.
which is what our tradition, that's where our Torah came from, is from
Right.
oral,
Oh, sure.
telling oral history.
That's
This
exactly
is
what I
continuing,
said.
this is just continuing that same tradition. And again, we get into tradition as well, but oral
Mhm.
history is how I would classify these two.
Okay, good,
Point.
good, good. All right.
I do
And, you know, and the imperative to participate in that oral history. Okay, I want to move on. We could indeed spend an hour on each of these pages, but if you go to the one that's called "Why Be Afraid," there's a long story, but I want to skip that one. But this is this reference to the you know, using music and the Hasidic nigun that some of you know about, like just a tune that you sing without having words, whatever. So over near the end of the page, Rabbi Naphtali the Hasid had a quick-witted son. One day, that's not a derogatory statement. That's you know, a positive. Rabbi Naphtali, one day the father, to test him, said, "I'll give you a ducat if you can tell me where God is." The boy paused for only a moment. Father replied, "I'll give you 1,000 ducats if you can tell me where God isn't."
Oh,
No.
All right. So again, if the title at the top is "Why Be Afraid," is why be afraid no matter where you are, if you believe that God is with you wherever you are. So look on the next one. As the Baal Shem Tov lay on his deathbed, his Hasidim stood about him and wept bitterly. He said, "Let me see no tears on your faces. I'm only going out one door and in through another." That's this world and the next world. You know, olam haba, olam hazeh, and olam haba, the world, this world and the world to come. When the Baal Shem's son entered and bent over his father, he received from the dying man the message which had become the watchword of his life. Remember always, wherever you go, wherever you are, God is with you. Why then ever be afraid? And if you had read the longer story, if your eyesight was good enough, or if Marsha let you borrow the magnifying glass, and you know, and whatever to read it, you know, the long one was how Israel ben Eliezer, the Baal Shem Tov, had taken the children into the forest, and you know, on the one. So my question is, with all of this, is what are those actions, or what are those simple statements by which we can demonstrate our ultimate total faith, belief, or acceptance that God is everywhere? The Baal Shem Tov took all the children in the forest, even though they're afraid of the boogeyman, they're afraid of whatever was going to be out there, and said, "We'll all hold hands, we'll all sing a song together, and we will go, and I will prove to you that everything will be okay. God is there, God is protecting you," et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So go ahead, Ricky.
Yeah. When I read that story, I thought of such an example in my own life. My daughter, one of my daughters, is avid jock. You know, okay, she was a through hiker of the Appalachian Trail, and we were taking her to Mount Katahdin, and they decided to go up the shortest path, which meant it was the steepest. Well, I have acrophobia. I know it. Boom. So anyway, I started up with the group, and I just got to a point that my acrophobia kicked in, and I said, "You guys go ahead. I'll work my way back down. I'll meet you at the car." And I stopped for a minute and I said, "Okay, God, you got me up here. You got to get me down." Well, just as I said that, I saw the head of a couple, the heads of a couple people that were coming up. It was so steep, I couldn't see, down to where my feet would go. But I saw these heads coming up, then a nose, then the whole body. And they're asking me, hey, what's it like way up there? And I'm just like, thank you, God. You sent these people, these hikers. But it was my willingness, I think, to say, okay, you got me up here, you got to get me down. And instantly, I got the way down. And I do remember once somebody said to me, if you're really afraid, think about what would you do if you weren't afraid? And that's also putting myself in God's hand. But that time on the mountain, I was frozen. And I've gone down a lot of steep hills on my butt because I couldn't stand up and see where my feet were going to land. But that one was just an example of that kind of thing. So that's what, when I read those fear stories, I know God's there. Hey, I'm going to get down off this mountain. He got me up here.
Very often we look for signs.
Oh yeah.
We try to, and sometimes we see the sign and then ask ourselves, well, what's the message? I mean, one of the Hasidic things, there's a whole long story about it, but the bottom line is that God hears all prayers, God answers all prayers, but sometimes the answer is no.
Yes.
Okay?
I didn't get a sign. I got a
Ruth, come on in.
I want to ask a couple of questions. First of all, does anybody else have the kind of problem I have with the Hasidim? I feel it's totally a man's world. Women couldn't do more.
I'm not nodding with pride. I'm acknowledging acknowledging the problem.
Nothing new.
And I'm not a raging women's liber, but somehow Hasidim make me, the women are back home cooking and having the babies and no acknowledgement of that. And that sort of bothers me. I also have a very easy question for you.
Just to point it out, there is, and it's small. There are minor collections, not so much of stories, but of prayers and teachings. Maybe I'd call them litanies that were written by women in the shtetl, 1600s, 1700s, 1800s.
Really?
Many of them are called, the Yiddish word is techinas. Now, those of you who eat Mediterranean food and you think of tahina, I'm not talking about hummus and tahina. It's techinas. It's a Yiddish pronunciation of a prayer, a particular type of prayer. Those of you who have a more traditional background, you might remember in the prayer book, there are certain prayers that fall into the rubric of what's called tachanun. They're prayers asking about specific types of forgiveness and acceptance. And there's a small body of literature of some of these techinas that were written by women. But Ruth, you're absolutely correct. The women, for the most part, in the Hasidim and in the ultra-Orthodox are very silent.
Are invisible. I have a very specific question. What does the word apokorsi mean?
An apokoros is like a non-believer.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah, it's a Greek word. It appears actually in rabbinic literature back in the Talmud. It's Greek. It's an apokoros is someone who's a non-believer. A lot of the stories in the Talmud, for example, an apokoros came to Rabbi Yehuda and asked him about such and such.
I know it in context with a song that my grandfather sang to me that I'd love to find.
Oh yeah, okay.
What's happening?
Someone's ding-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling.
And
But he's beeping.
the Nagin and the chorus don't believe the story. That was the chorus of that song. So now it makes sense.
Okay. Does someone have a speaker on or something?
Yeah.
I'm not sure what it
Somebody's
is.
getting
All right.
feedback.
Yes.
Something's going on.
But
Okay.
I don't know, do other women feel that way? I mean, about being totally left out of the Hasidic, whatever.
Well,
I frankly haven't had much conversation with women of that community, but I don't know. Bobby, Sherry?
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you can hear me okay, I'm getting that feedback and it's really bothering my
I don't
ears.
know what's going on.
I can hear you.
Okay.
Excuse
I have had relationships with Hasidim. Back in Buffalo where I'm from, there's a big Hasidic community and many of my friends are Hasidic and the wives, and I can speak with the husbands if the right context. We can say hello, we can meet, how are you, different things. We can even have a serious conversation of holidays, of religion. But you have
You
to
mean
know
you
how
and
to.
you and the Hasidic women?
No,
Yeah,
even
with the
with their
men.
husbands and
With
other
the
family
husbands.
members. They are very open, very easy to speak to, I found.
The men,
The men, yes.
right?
Yes.
But what I think
And the women
Ruth's
also.
questioning whether
I have a very
whether the
good
women
friend who's
communicate
Hasidic.
their
Right.
feelings.
I have a good
Well-
friend who's Hasidic. She accepts me for what I am. She knows I'm not religious. That I do what I do, and I'm not Shomer. Don't keep Shabbat as she does, but she's accepting of me the way I am, and so is her husband. They understand, and we just don't discuss that part of it. This is what we discuss, and this is what we talk, and that's what it is.
Okay, Sharon, yeah.
Yeah. So my comment to Bruce's feeling is understand the feeling 100+% because I did not grow up, in any Orthodox or Hasid or, any of those. However, I have been exposed to them. And I do not like the feeling of when I went to synagogue years ago with my group of friends and it was, super Orthodox and the women were over in one place and the men were in the other. And I'm like, whoa. And then went with a dear friend to family event at Temple. And when I met his uncle and proceeded to greet him, of course, he wouldn't touch me. And for me, this did not feel good as a woman, as a human being, etc. So I fully understand what Ruth says. I've had those feelings, but those did not come up for me now because I know it exists. And I so in this context, it didn't come up for me, but boy, I understand the feeling totally. So
Ruth,
Ruth,
you
I
wanted to-
understand.
Yeah, I was just going to say, from my experience, the women, the Hasidic, the ultra Orthodox women, actually feel somewhat liberated in these things because they don't have the obligations that their husbands have. They look at the commandments, and of the 613, there are so many fewer for women, and they feel very liberated by that. And I know I had a lot of friends whose Saturday morning, the religious upbringing of the children was the husband's responsibility. So on Saturday morning, he was responsible for taking them to shul for Shabbat services, and she took a bubble bath. Or something. I mean, that was her morning off. She did not have to cook. She did not have to clean. She did not have to take care of the kids. It was his obligation. He had these obligations that had to be met. And a lot of them feel very liberated by that. I think it's all in what you know. I think it just comes from your background, from what you're accustomed to. And we women who are accustomed to being, or wanting to be equal in every way, and wanting our husbands to be, just as equal as we are, we feel it different, but they don't feel it that way. They feel, like I said, they feel very liberated because they don't have to meet all the commandments.
Yeah, but that's also speaking for a whole group. And I'm, as in any group, there are differentiations and people that don't like it and leave. So, you know,
I
my
wasn't,
comment.
I wasn't really speaking about anecdotes and that kind of story. I think that to go back to the Hasidic movement, it is entirely a male-oriented movement, in my opinion, from what I observe.
Yeah.
Like I said, I agree that the literature, certainly the literature that has come down to us is very, very much male oriented. There are some stories here and there, and I think I may have even referred to one or two, but there are. I want to give you a quote from Nachman of Bratslav that falls into this same thing, talking about, do we see God everywhere? The Torah study people here remember the phrase that God uses talking to Moses at the burning bush. Yeah, I am what I am going to be. I will be what I will be. Whatever. But Nachman teaches it this way: just as a hand that is held before the eyes can hide the tallest mountain, so the business of life often keeps our gaze from the vast beauty and awe that fill the world. So his question is, Fran, you're hiding your eyes.
Oh, I had something
the question is, what can we do, or what need we do to remove the hand from that's blocking us, right? From seeing the world. Go ahead, Fran. Go ahead.
I'm sort of remembering one of the stories in Buber's Tales of the Hasidic Masters that was referring to some rabbi's wife or mother. And she had lost a child or her husband, I don't remember, but she's out collecting for charity. And someone said, how can you be out there collecting money, when you're mourning? And she said, the poor should suffer because I am in mourning. That's close enough.
Right.
So
there certainly are some of those references to mothers, to wives. I can't think of any offhand to daughters, but mothers and wives, yes.
Yeah. Mothers and wives were once daughters. We know
that's true. That's true.
So they're, without the obligation to have to pray, there are many, many examples of Jewish women who were pious and
question.
They had divine powers.
Right. Just not. I think Ruth's point is that you just don't see that much of it, or hear or read that much of it in this body of literature representing the ultra-Orthodox.
That is my point.
Yeah.
There's a reason.
Okay, let's try to do one more section. You have that as the palace and the maze.
Okay.
That's number 4. Okay. The storyteller puts his glasses back on. Doing the one in the middle of the page first. One day, little Yechiel was playing hide and seek with his friend. Having hidden himself well, he waited and waited and waited to be found. But a long time passed, and the friend did not come near. Then Yechiel realized that his friend had not so much as even begun to look for him. He burst into tears and ran to his grandfather. Although this could be grandmother, Ruth, I guess, but crying. Said, grandfather, Zadie, he didn't even try to find me. And as the tears brimmed in the grandfather's eyes too, he answered, God says the same thing. I hide, but no one wants to seek me. Now, some people would immediately jump on that and say, why is God hiding? That's not necessarily the point of the story. And then yet again, a king planted a great garden, and in the midst of it he set a maze To every visitor, he said, enter by this door and seek the center of the maze. I don't know if Lenny Friedman's still with us talking about the labyrinth, but okay. There you will find what you have longed for all your life. Many entered eagerly and found the alleys of the maze perfumed as they were with flowers, pleasant to wander in. The more they wandered, the less urgent became their desire to find what they had longed for when they set out. But before they gave up, they cried out, why must you place your heart's desire at the center of a difficult maze? Why can we not find it without effort? Then the voice of the king came to them from the center of the maze, for he himself was what they most desired without knowing it. It is only by seeking and wandering through my pleasant maze that you can prepare yourselves for my presence. The seeking is a necessary part of the finding, for without the effort of seeking, you would not know that you had found me. The phrase that doesn't appear here, that with which all of us are familiar, that there's so many references and parables to a king. You know, and they say it's Melech Basar Badam, a flesh and blood king, as opposed to Melech Malchei Hamlachim, the Holy One, the King of Kings, the God above. So God has his palace, and the palace is the world in which we are living, and we have to make our way through the maze to get to the center. Like I said, I'd love to have Lenny comment or someone comment about the labyrinth parallel as well. But there's the understanding of if we can find our way through the Olam Hazeh, through this world, through the maze and the difficulties of this world, how much the more so will be the prize at the end. Now that may not be our own contemporary 21st century acceptance of what happens in the afterlife, but that certainly reflects the feeling of the Hasidim, that if you can find your way through the maze and all of its difficulties, twists and turns and whatever, and take time to smell the flowers and whatever along the way. But if you can find your way into the center, then indeed you have found the Holy One, you have found the King, et cetera, et cetera. And again, that may not be our philosophy or theology of life and death today, but it was of the Hasidim. Don, I know your hand went up.
Yeah, Lenny would point out that a labyrinth is not a maze.
Right.
Labyrinth,
Yeah.
one way in and one way out. I just know there's a contrast between that story and the Christian point of view.
Oh, yes.
Christians say you don't have to do any work at all. You just, when you hear the knock, you just open the door.
Well,
and all the work.
Not all Christian denominations, but many, right? Mm-hmm.
But it's in contrast. It's great difference in effort.
No question.
And I don't understand. I'd like to hear somebody, talk about that, because I don't pretend to.
Okay.
Profound difference, but I'm not
right.
smart enough to.
Marty, is that a hand raised?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes. These stories remind me of the concept, again, that going back to Hasidic thinking of Tzimtzum.
Right.
Yeah.
I may be pronouncing it incorrectly. Where God,
Tzimtzum in Hebrew,
where God has hidden Himself,
right,
purposefully. And if you think about it, if it was easy to find God, if it was easy, and we lived in a world like the Garden of Eden, we would never do anything for getting ahead in the way we look at it today. That there would be no reason to learn. There would be no reason to do. Everything is there. And so the philosophy was that this is a gift from God by not showing himself, that it is that it allows us to live as human beings. And that's what I got out of these stories.
Mm-hmm. Chris?
Yes, Rabbi, kind of thinking about the another proverb system. Oh dear, I was waiting for you to call my name and I forgot what I'm gonna say.
Green Valley.
That's awful. That is the Proverbs. The Proverbs. Is that similar to that in a way? That's what the Proverbs talk about. It's a story of. It's not presented the same way, but I was just thinking the Proverbs has a lot to sayings like that can be applied like the Hasidic stories.
You say Proverbs or prophets?
No, Proverbs. That like what it says, you shall not do this, or you shall not allow your children to do this, or I can hold on. That's the Proverbs.
No. Again, I think you're talking specifically about the style.
Okay. Yes.
Right. The Proverbs, I'm not sure that it's the same thing. Proverbs give us a teaching, call it a teaching style, if you will, that is similar to what we use in Pirkei Avot, in Ethics of the Fathers, for example.
All right.
Here's a quick statement, and while there may be what's the right way of describing it? Commentary, like so the phrase that I used, that I talked about before, that the world stands on three things: on Torah, on service or worship, and on loving deeds. Okay. And it could end there. Proverbs would give that statement. What the rabbinic literature does is continue to say, okay, so that's Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. That's what he says, the three things. But Rabbi Meir says there are three different things. And then Rabbi Yehuda comes along and says, no, there are actually four things. And the literature builds up that way. It may include it, but the text itself doesn't necessarily include the story.
Yeah, that's true. Okay? On the Proverbs, right?
Or bringing it into life. That's what the Haggadah. We mentioned it earlier too. On Passover is we could have it be a much shorter service if the Haggadah was only bullet points. Right?
Sure.
But
sounds like a plan.
What a fantasy.
PowerPoint,
okay. Here, look, there are 4 questions, or some people would say there are 5 questions. How long can it take to answer 5 questions? Unless you start telling all these other stories. Well, my father was a wandering Aramean, and and
here we go again.
All the different things with Dayenu, and it expands. But again, I go back to reminding all of us that who's the audience for this story, for these stories. Okay, the audience is not people who knew the Torah,
no, it's
us, or knew any of that. The audience are these, and they're not apikorsim that she was asking about. They're not non-believers. They're people who just don't have the knowledge or the education and the familiarity with this. It's not like they even go to shul every Saturday morning to hear the Torah story, to hear the Torah reading. So these are the lessons. The word I was looking for is aphorism.
Okay.
APHERIS, right? They're
Got
they're aphorisms, as
Mhm.
opposed to these stories from which we learn, Aesop's fables, or we learn
Right.
a moral or something out of the story. Sherry, then Rick.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Rabbi.
Thank you. Okay, so I had two reactions about the story and the maze. Okay. The first reaction I had was, the journey, how important the journey is
Oh,
of
yeah.
life, of anything,
You're
that
not
when we
moving from
become
those.
so focused on arriving at the goal, we are not present in the whole process and in our life. And so, and sometimes people will get there and it's empty. And then, and getting there, that's all lost because they didn't experience all that. And the other part that I experienced was that, and it related to what Marty said, which is, the struggle, the seeking, because, we're somewhere and we want faith, or we want answers, or we want to feel, protected and safe. It's like that struggle. And like so many people talk about, we don't invite them, we don't welcome them, but yet they're part of the fabric of life. And that is, how we grow, how we change, how we learn. And then with, whether it's passing along our own life stories or any stories, then whatever it is, can be passed along, and then somebody else can learn what we went through. So
I think I think you're adding on to what I was trying to say before, of the difference between the Hasidic approach to life and the way that most of us in a more modern contemporary world would say. I'm searching for a quote that's in the prayer book somewhere in the English, that it is, which is more important, the end result or the things that we learn along the way?
All the way.
And the encounters that we have and the relationships
Sure.
that we make along the way. And
Right.
if we don't ultimately get to what our goal was, it's okay.
You're right.
It's
In the
okay
end,
because of
yeah.
what has happened along the way. But that would not be the Hasidic teaching. They would
Well,
not-
as in all things, I, like everyone else, bring, who I am to it. And I know
Sure,
that, of
sure.
course. But yes,
Sure.
thank you.
Okay, Ricky, yeah.
Speaking with the seeking, I know that, when I was first starting out as a young adult and I finally saved up enough money to buy a real piece of furniture that was, mine, and I worked hard and I saved, and, it meant so much more to me than if I had just found a sofa on the sidewalk that was given to me. So the more I worked towards something, the more valuable it became to me, or the more I appreciated it, because it didn't just drop in my lap. And I think that's what, I got out of the seeking, because I spent a lot of years seeking which path, since I come from two very distinct heritages, and which one I ended up in. But that's not even the point. The point is, now things come to me easily, fortunately, because I've lived long enough to have most of what I need and blah, blah, blah. But things meant more to me when I had to work harder to get them. And
Right.
that's what the seeking means. It's, yes, the journey, but there's so much, if I really work hard to get something, I really value that. If it
Mhm.
just lands,
Yeah.
Okay, I got it. Whoopee.
There is, and this will be a closing comment. There is at least the first Reconstructionist, some of you know the Reconstructionist movement, the first Reconstructionist synagogue in Jerusalem was founded in the mid-1960s.
Okay.
The rabbi who did it, I'm blanking on his name, Jack something, had been a Hillel director in the States. and he made Aliyah and moved to Israel. And the name for the synagogue that he specifically founded there and chose was Mivakshei Derech, Seekers of the Way.
Wow.
Right.
Oh,
Okay,
Yeah.
that's specifically, he says we're not going to be Temple Sinai. We're not going to be B'nai Israel synagogue or whatever it is. We're going to be mivak. We're going to be seekers of the way, and that's what I hear you're saying. So I see that we've reached the end of our time today. I thank you for joining us on this in this experience. Look forward to next week as well, and then we'll be off for a week because it's Thanksgiving,
Okay.
and then we'll continue on with there. Ruth Ann, any announcements?